Hello, my name's James Patterson, and I'm here for another informal and unedited discussion with a good colleague, Hilary Fraser. Hilary, we're going to talk about risk management and boards. Just give us a quick introduction.
Hello. Thank you for the chance of being able to have this conversation, James. So I'm an organisation development director. Until fairly recently, I've been living in Switzerland in international roles. I'm also a NEDM board member. I've been working in internal auditing for approximately 20 years and also have a parallel career in organisation design and development, which has given me quite an interesting perspective on things.
Lovely. And you and I share this in common. I've worked in tax and corporate finance. I've been a head of internal audit, but I've also worked in HR, and now I sort of combine my interest in HR with my interest in auditing, looking at a particular set of topics. Brilliant. Lovely to have you here, Hilary.
Thank you.
And what we thought we would cover is do a little bit on the background of risk management and governance and compliance at the moment, talking about the problem of dealing with unlikely risks. Hilary's got a great expression for that. And then also looking in detail at how do organisations think about and manage key risks. This includes the question of how does a board and how do senior managers get assurances on key risks? And one of the interesting areas Hilary will talk about is how do we see the role of internal audit as well, particularly in relation to assurances. And we're then going to move on from a discussion about the kind of business and risk end into some of the so-called softer areas, culture, and then also to the level of board effectiveness. So that's what we're going to do.
Yeah.
And by way of background, I've got a list here of what you would call GRC, governance, risk management and compliance issues. And needless to say, as we record this video in 2020, the last major corporate governance issues that we'll all be aware of is the financial difficulties in the late 2000s. But then onwards, we've got the BP Deepwater Horizon incident. We've got other scandals, the Volkswagen emission scandals, and then it's not hard to look more recently at problems with the Elizabeth Line under London, Grenfell Tower, various data breaches, corporate collapses, and of course Notre Dame, all leading up to COVID-19 with the stuff around the shortage of PPE and ventilators and so on and so forth. So I think, you know, part of the background behind Hilary and I wanting to do this video is, yes, we may be good in many ways at governance, at risk management and compliance, but actually when you look at the track record just over the last 12 years, there seems to be an awful lot of things that haven't gone as well as we might have hoped they would. And this has got to be something I'm sure that board members and risk managers are thinking about, but certainly it's got to the level of members of the public as well.
I agree. What's absolutely fascinating for me is the people side of risks. Having specialised in HR governance with my internal audit hat on, and then also representing the people side of the business, and the two are not incompatible, in my opinion, in both my board positions. What is fascinating to see is how this keeps happening again and again, and then starting to ask some really deep questions about what is behind it. So in the list we've just seen, that only went back to 2008. But for instance, I spent 6 years working at a premier specialty chemicals company. And the tragic incident at Bhopal was still in conversations present in people's minds, because we were working on timeframes of approximate. Short term was considered 25 years. And when we were looking at the estimated useful life plus the ecological impact of a product and a production site, we were looking at 100 years. So again, I'd say that it needs to be something for boards to consider. What has happened, what is happening, what will happen, but what may never happen.
Yeah, very good. Lovely. Thank you very much for that. And so what we're going to do is look at some specific challenges. And, you know, one of the most famous things, as you said, going back further than the financial crisis, is 9/11. And one of the amazing phrases from the government report on 9/11 in terms of the main root causes of that was an expression that lives on to this day: a failure of imagination. So something is a high impact and a low probability. And the challenge here becomes, maybe we find it difficult to imagine that this really terrible thing will happen. And then you can start, as we are now in June 2020, looking forward, you can start to look at COVID, but also other issues, and ask the question, what is it that we're failing to imagine at the moment? Hilary, make some reflections on this issue of imagination.
I think this is a fascinating topic, and it's one of the areas that, for me, brings my board and internal audit and people experience together. And one of the if we go to the picture at the bottom of the slide with the elephant with risk written on it, if you've never seen an elephant before, how do you know what it is, and how can you describe it to someone else? And also we hear of elephants wrecking crops, stampeding, and also causing violence to human habitation. And rather than Nelly that we see in the picture books, and how do we know what the elephant is capable of if we've never come across this, and also we don't know how to talk about it?
So there's a really interesting issue here about being open about what you don't know. And, you know, I guess as we sit here, I've got the picture here of the Spanish flu waves 2 and waves 3, is a lot of people are hoping that there won't be big subsequent waves of COVID, but that's by no means guaranteed. I love the idea of, if you don't recognize the animal at all, being humble enough to sort of realize you don't know the damage it can do. And then one of the other things that we thought it'd be useful to think about is, even if we're getting warning signs that a risk is real, that a risk is coming, so it's starting to happen, one of the fascinating things is, how good is the antenna of the organization to look out for what might be described as weak signals? And I've got a little extract from the 2014 AirAsia plane crash. And in the investigation there, the aircraft company was quite good at collecting information about little problems that were going on. And what you can see here is, during the course of a year, they were collecting, up to September, little warning signs that something might go wrong. And then what actually happened is this issue accelerated and then led to the tragic loss of the Airbus in this case. So the issue, I guess, of how good is your organization at collecting weak signals such as incident and issue and near miss information is a really important thing to think about, because if you don't collect this, how are you going to know that there's a warning sign out there? And we can extend this a little bit further, Hilary, in terms of its impact at the board level. What are your reflections on this topic?
I'd say that the more prominent an organisation is in its sector, and having worked for some market leading organisations and also those with product leadership, the less likely they are, sadly from my experience, of being able to spot the cumulative impact of smaller incidents, and also to be able to extrapolate these, and also to consider the impact of when they come together as a larger incident. And so, for instance, a telecoms company I was working at, so Cable and Wireless, they don't exist anymore, so I can mention the name. I remember being present in some very heated discussions about the internet, and people who were adamant that it was just not something they were interested in, and it would fizzle out, and they would carry on being the premier network company. And similarly, in a premier pharma organisation that I was working with in an international role in Switzerland, where people had no concept whatsoever of the possibility of a raid by a competitor. But that was taking place in other parts of the organisation in other countries, and was proving a very real threat to protecting international intellectual property, as well as business performance. So what I'd say when it comes to risk is you have to look at what may never happen and bring in the unlikely and black swan risks, and be prepared as a board to entertain these as and imagine those as something that could happen, because one day they might well do.
I think what's really good is you've highlighted the point that it's not just about collecting incident information internally, the internal weak signals. You emphasize very nicely there the looking out, the scanning the horizon on things happening in other countries, different sectors, etc., that may not yet have affected you. And then the other issue, Hilary, that we've talked about before is this issue of, and it's the final diagram there, really having a clear framework for the escalation of weak signals up to the boards. Just say a little bit more about why that can be a challenge, Hilary, and why that's so important.
I think being a board member is not easy, and likewise being the chairman of a board, but also the CEO. When we look at the unitary board model, they are not easy jobs, and that should not be underestimated. And the pressure on performance, particularly shorter term and quantitative and monetary performance, is intense. And it's very easy to be so busy with what you're doing, carrying these significant responsibilities on your shoulders, that you just get caught up in what has happened, what will happen, what may never happen. And it's also one of the big disadvantages of forecasting, because you're going to a place you expect to arrive at based on what you've done before. And so these rather conventional frameworks for identifying, classifying, and also recognizing risk can often work against you when things become far more complex. And also, either internally or externally, you're up against risks that you haven't expected. And oftentimes this can be people risk.
Yes, no, that's a really good point there. You're talking about key risks that you face, and the fact that if it really is a key risk, and that should be like a high impact, I've written here, high impact, very high impact, dangerously high. You're raising a really great point there, Hilary, that board members should expect these issues to be analysed in some detail. I mean, an interesting thing, and I'll come back to you in a second, if you think about COVID is a really good example of a risk that has an incredibly high velocity. It comes at you really, really quickly. So you can't just say, well, let's discuss that risk in 3 months' time. By the time 3 months has gone by, the world has changed. And then the other amazing thing that we've just had emphasised in spades with COVID is, how is your organisation seeing the connections? I've got connectivity here between the risk that's coming at you and all the other things it's going to have an impact on. So my main message at this stage is, building on what Hilary said is be prepared to analyse your key risks in more detail than you would analyse other risks. And some of the phrases that we've got here, and Hilary, you mentioned intangible, you might want to say more about that. These are the kinds of things that you need to be doing in order to stand a chance of dealing with this strange, new, dangerous animal. More reflections on this, Hilary?
I'd say frequently, however uncomfortable it is, the board has to re-examine the way it identifies, evaluates and analyses its risks. And so I'd say the red, amber, green, the red, yellow, green, also the high, medium, low can actually work against you. So I have been in situations where I've been conducting operational reviews and organisational reviews where risks have been discounted because of the classification, yet the business impact would have been significant. So one example at an organisation that's since been taken over, so I can talk about it, is where post acquisition, you had two segments of the workforce at parallel levels who were on completely different terms of business and contracted in completely different ways. And this would have been really complicated and a lot of work to sort out. But because the business was highly unionized, the impact of this information getting out between the two groups would have been significant, and if anything, stopped the whole business in its tracks. But the decision was taken to discount this risk for the purposes of this audit. And in fact, it wasn't even included in the audit report because they didn't want to deal with it. And so what I've learned from that is the significance of not only how quickly something can take off and how significant a risk can become, so the velocity. All it would have taken is one conversation about what someone was doing on a Friday night with their overtime money, and suddenly you're faced with business shutdown probably within a few days. How that could be managed, and then also the complexity of dealing with the fallout, which brings us back to people risk. And so again, I would say it's an area that is intangible but has very tangible impact, and can also affect business internally and externally.
Yeah, that's lovely, Hilary. Very helpful, granular example. And then one of the other things we wanted to talk about is this issue of assurance. So senior managers want assurance that things are going okay. And one of the tools for assurance is internal audit. And of course, one of the things that I've got here is some of the assurances that have taken place in relation to pandemic planning that have been potentially not listened to. And so what you've got here, back to what you said earlier, Hilary, is management are really busy. They've got lots of short-term pressing issues to deal with, and how easy it is to regard an unhelpful audit report as an unwelcome visitor, where things can be downplayed or remediation can be delayed. And one of the things that I would say, and I hate to use this technical phrase, but you can make it very practical, is, you know, if I was advising anybody about an assurance report, it's, well, what is your risk appetite for this issue? And I like to turn that into practical terms. So, you know, would it be okay if this project was a few months late? Would it be okay if your product launch was 10 million below budget? And I would always be focusing my assurance efforts to answer a really meaningful exam question and not just request an abstract assurance report. So I think it's incumbent on the people who are requesting assurances to really be clear about, well, what would good look like? Because when that becomes clear, you can then make sure that the assurance work that gets done is going to be at the right level of granularity to flush out issues. Any other reflections on this issue and other ways of thinking about how to use internal audit, Hilary?
Well, I'm a huge fan of internal audit. I mean, it's been I've been in the profession, so I qualified and been in the profession for approximately since 1996. And for me, internal audit has got an incredibly powerful and important role in the organisation. So it's one of the few parts of an organisation, and it's one of some of the few people who can really see something from end to end, so along the value chain. They can really see from top level, but also down deep, what is going on. And I think internal audit are also in the privileged position of not only being able to take the mandate given by the board, the strategic direction set, but to see how this is playing out. I also think that internal audit is in a position to be able to benchmark internally as well as externally, and also to transfer the information they're given. What I feel is a lost opportunity is some internal audit functions focus on what I call exception-based auditing, where it's all about finding fault and it's all about reporting what is going on, but sadly what is going wrong. And internal auditors got a really valuable opportunity to not only highlight where resources are being allocated, so using the definition of economy, efficiency and effectiveness, but also to be able to have a deep understanding of the organisation context, the organisation as a system, and to be able to transfer what is working as well as alert to what is not working.
I think it's a great observation. I think that often management get faced with, well, if I implement that recommendation, that's automatically going to be expensive or a distraction. Yeah. And if your internal audit function is a progressive internal audit function, you're absolutely right, Hilary. It should be able to bring to the party good practice from externally or benchmarking even internally to say, actually, there is a way of addressing this issue that's not quite as bad in terms of disruption as you thought it would be. And again, yep. I think this is the important thing, is getting that sense of what kind of internal audit department have you got? Are they progressive? Or are they just theoretical? Because obviously with COVID, we can't afford to have lots of internal audit functions operating in a very theoretical, abstract way without coming up with solutions as well as issues.
Yep.
Very good, yep. Hilary. Thank you very much indeed. Yep. We wanted to say, we're going to build up to boards in a minute, something about this whole intangible side. And I always like to think of things very distinctly between, having the right culture, but also paying attention to behavior. And you and I both worked in HR and studied in this area. I always like to say to people, culture is absolutely not what's in your code of conduct, what you train people on, and what the posters on the wall look like. The famous analogy is of the iceberg. It's about the way things really happen around here, never mind what posters you've got on the wall or what you spent 2 hours training on. And the other thing I always like to stress to people, and I think we've seen this so clearly with COVID, is you can have quite a nice culture, but in a particular part of your organization with a particular manager, the behavior there or the subculture may be very different. And equally, you can have a change like COVID, where you've suddenly got to impose headcount constraints, lay people off. And that culture that you thought you'd built up and you thought was there is gone overnight in an instant. The behavior changes. And often I think people have too simplistic a view of culture as this static thing. And I always like to think of it in terms of the culture is the general climate, but actually the behavior, and that's often what matters, is what happens on a particular day. And too often we have these loose language around culture and we don't think enough about behavior. And that behavior can be caused by strategic pressures or organizational factors, which can be much more localized. Hilary, do you want to make some more reflections on this whole behavior and culture area?
I know this is one area that the Institute of Internal Auditors have been moving towards, and particularly after the financial crisis of 2008 and the fallout in 2009. And we both know Manny Sher at the Tavistock Institute well, and the work that he has done with the Financial Reporting Council on advising them of the role of culture and how that translates into organisational and also business performance. So what's also interesting is you're the third person I've ever met who has actually spanned this people and internal auditing skill set. So I'd say that culture is something that's difficult to get your hands around, so back to the intangible, but on the other hand, it has a very tangible impact. I'd say there is still an important role for pulse surveys and also the regular engagement surveys, but they are one way of being able to make something essentially qualitative, quantitative. And at all times, we have to look below the waterline, which is a phrase coined by one of my sources of inspiration, a really great guy called John Scherer. And what he has emphasized, and what I also really believe in, is you have to see something in context, and you have to look at what is going on, but then look at what is not going on. So for instance, if we look at companies, for instance, that emphasize having a performance culture, one of the shadow sides, or the dark side of that, for instance, with the annual engagement survey, is looking at the levers that have been designed into an organization, for instance, through its HR policies and practices, and how reward is used to nudge, encourage, and promote certain behaviors. So having worked in organizations before, for instance, with the annual engagement survey, where there's been a link directly and indirectly between a manager's survey results, their bonus, their promotion prospects, their performance rating, and then what is intended to encourage performance actually prevents it, because then the manager can unfortunately over control and micromanage and potentially punish the performance of their people for having spoken openly and honestly, even when these comments might have been intended constructively.
I think you've used a fabulous thing. I think the importance of board members and senior executives worrying or thinking about the soft aspect of things. And as we've talked about before, Hilary, not just what's the average level of satisfaction, but what's the extreme ends of the satisfaction. You can have average, people are happy, but where are the areas where people are not so happy, and what's going on there? And it's very important, I think, to not take things at face value. And I thought your example of there is a well-intended reward system to link staff satisfaction with reward, but actually it will create a culture in which people potentially game the culture survey. And I think it's incumbent on board members and senior executives to think about the well-intentioned things they're doing and what the potential shadow is. Otherwise, you're effectively kind of deluding yourself. It's a great analogy, the below the waterline, and it links to the final point that Hilary and I want to talk about, which is the whole issue of corporate governance and board effectiveness. And, you know, the fundamental challenge for board effectiveness is the board is simplistically, in the C-suite, the executive group, is at the very top of a pyramid. And so this issue of all issues effectively culminate up in the executive and the board. And this is a very challenging place for people who may have spent their lifetimes getting there. They don't want to do a bad job. So inevitably, by the way, you get into this issue of realizing that things can be quite political at this top level. It's often not talked about as much as it needs to. And then, Hilary, I think something that you're going to talk us through is, in practical terms, some of the implications of that for board effectiveness and board operation.
It is a significant adjustment from being the guy or the girl, him or her, at the top of an organisational tree, to then take the next step, become a board member, and to be, rather than the one figurehead to be one of a collective. And it's not easy. It's not easy being a CEO or a member of a C-suite or occupying a senior management position. It's equally not easy to be a board member. The responsibilities of both roles are significant, but they are different. And I'd say what's important as well is that the board needs to embrace needs to look very carefully at its composition to make sure that its client demographic, its internal demographic, and also its product and customers are represented. So I'd say more and more the arguments for boardroom diversity are becoming louder and louder. And if we go back to the slide at the beginning of the presentation with the number of corporate failures that we've seen and those we've discussed, let alone those which are probably still due to come. If we've had a certain demographic present at senior management level, at board level, these things are happening again and again. So I would argue the call is getting louder, and the time really is now for more diversity in the boardroom. And from the boards I sit on, if you have diversity of perspective, experience, background, culture, you are a better board. However, again, so if we click on the next part of the slide and we look at the next few circles, what's important is how the board functions and its decision making. And this is where my knowledge and experience of organisation design and development have really helped inform this opinion. A board is a group, and it may be a group of very experienced and also powerful individuals, but nonetheless it needs to function as a group. And a board needs to do its own work to, for instance, to understand its own practical but also psychological processes. And a board needs to decide how to decide. And some of this will be set out in the timing and also the frequency of when they meet and what is talked about and when. There is also a significant amount of work that is done between board meetings, which should not be underestimated. But ultimately, for a board to be highly functioning and to be effective, and also to fulfill the role that it's given, for instance, by the latest Code of Corporate Governance, a board needs to know how it works, what it's supposed to do, and decide how to decide.
I think it's brilliant, Hilary, how you sort of brought things together. On your diversity point, you've highlighted, don't think of diversity as this separate thing. Think of it as one of the tools that you've got to stop you lacking imagination. Yes. Even if it means, I mentioned earlier, I was talking to a friend who's on a board, and they were talking about, you know, I want it to be one happy family. And I was saying, I'm not sure that is the right model in your mind to have of a board. It's a family that needs to have its discussions and its disagreements, because that's actually a sign of health, to be able to clear the air. And I think what you've highlighted as well in your last comment about the board dynamic and the way it decides how it's going to decide is, because it's at the top of the pyramid, issues around the functioning of meetings, which may seem to be relatively unimportant lower down, become magnified at the top of an organisation. And it brings me on, in fact, to a couple of things I wanted to say, and then we'll wrap up. I'm working sometimes with, you know, the secretary of the board, and the issue of how is the board scheduling its time?
Yep.
And then how is the board actually spending its time?
Yep.
And is the time that the board is spending really on the critical issues that it faces, or is it sometimes getting sidetracked on minor issues? This becomes a really important thing for a board to think about, and it moves on to this point about learning and development. How good is the organisation at a top level and the senior board members at recognising that they themselves may need training, not just on the group dynamics that Hilary talked about, But I'm often finding when I'm working with heads of internal audit or risk managers, the risk manager was saying, I really wish my board member
Yeah.
understood more about modern risk management.
Yeah.
Because they've obviously been great in the past, but things have moved on. But it's quite awkward for me to say to this really senior, really successful person, actually, I think you need a little bit of training on how
Yeah.
internal audit or how risk management has moved on. So these are often undiscussed topics, but it's very important when Hilary and I were talking about why we're doing this video, it's to bring up perhaps slightly less spoken about issues which are really central if you want to have a successful organisation and a functioning board. Any final reflections from you, Hilary, before we sign off?
I really agree with the topic about learning and development, and just because someone has reached board level and that is effectively at the top of their organisation, they still have to work very hard to stay there, which does involve a certain humility and also involves knowing what you don't know. And so as part of the learning and development, there's some great courses out there. So as I met, for instance, the Institute of Directors have their Chartered Director Diploma. I've also done their Role of the NED course, which I found was really helpful in getting a handle on what I needed to know from a technical perspective. But then there is also, if we apply the 70-20-10 model, what you can learn in action. So the role of having a board level coach, having a board level mentor, the pivotal role of the chair on setting the tone. And also, I would say to every board member that you need to spend time sitting in the canteen, walking the corridors, shaking people's hands and asking them how they are and what's going on, and finding out literally face to face what is happening in your business.
Lovely, fantastic. Well, look, if people want to get in touch with you, Hilary, it's Hilary Claire Fraser, and you're on LinkedIn with those details. My website details are below. So if you can't get in touch with Hilary that way, get in touch with me. And it's been an absolute pleasure doing this, Hilary. Thank you so much.
For me too. Thank you.